Hello, hello, hello.
Hey, hey.
You're joining us for another episode of
Chili Grits Podcast.
And of course, we're elated to be here once again. We are on episode number 4.
Yes.
And I think things are going pretty good. We're settling into
We
this.
are. We got a rhythm.
We do. And we're getting so much great feedback from individuals that have tested it out and said that they like chili grits.
Yes. So I am Dr. Aisha Francis.
And I am Reverend Monica Bowman. And we created Chili Grits Podcast to really talk about all of those Southern sayings that has shaped our lives and influenced our ability to grow into the leaders that we are. And so we take those sayings and we have conversations and we share them with you.
Yes, we do. And one of the things that we asked for our audience to provide are ideas about sayings that we should consider interrogating.
Yes.
And so there was one in particular that was already on our short list.
Yes.
That also was suggested by a dear friend and mentor of mine, Dennis. Shout out to you. And that is, God willing and the creek don't rise.
God willing and the creek doesn't rise.
God willing don't rise.
Oh, don't rise.
No,
Okay.
doesn't.
Okay.
You gotta say it right now.
Okay.
Gotta say it right.
Me and my Northeast Cambridge stuff going on over here. Okay.
God willing and the creek don't rise.
Don't rise. Okay.
So, one of the things that we really enjoyed a lot is sort of surprising each other, both folks raised in the South, with how many of each other's phrases, turns of phrase, we actually don't really know very well.
Yeah.
Or we know, but they're slightly different
Yeah.
and said slightly differently. And so this is an example of one, because Monica, in your experience, you had heard a truncated version of this, right?
Yes. So the version I heard or experienced growing up is the God willing.
Just God willing.
God willing, it'll happen. God willing. But this other part, like the creek don't, right?
And the creek don't rise.
Don't rise. Like, I am not familiar with that part.
That's brand new.
So I need a sense of like background, a little history,
Yes.
or like just some context around that part.
Okay, so listen, I looked this up. I can't find a whole lot of stuff on this, but I can just tell you from lived experience why this comes about. So the phrase means, for people who don't know, essentially, you can set a plan in motion. You can have a plan in your head. And ultimately, you are not in control of whether or not those plans take place. So that is how you use God willing and the creek don't rise. So my intention is to see you at church Sunday morning, God willing and the creek don't rise.
Yes.
Because there are things that might happen, natural disasters
Yeah.
or the divine. And I am always going to be beholden to those things that might change the outcome for me or change my plans. So that's what it means. It's more of a throwaway phrase, God willing. I am very familiar with people just using the cutoff.
The God willing.
Yes, but it was also very frequently used, at least in my background, the entire phrase. And the way that I think it resonates in particular in the natural world is because, there are a lot of tributaries in the Mid-South. It's a river. Nashville, where I grew up, is a river city. Mm-hmm. And lots of creeks and all of these kinds of things. And that whole Mid-South area was extremely prone to flooding, which is why even being inland, it's a low lying, it's a basin. And, a lot of places that are either coastal or basin cities will understand this, that there's a ton of infrastructure needs that were slow to come to certain areas of the South. And there were just certain streets that I remember my mother saying, or my grandparents saying, listen, when it rains, don't go such and such way.
Yeah.
Because the streets flood if they were low lying. And this is even after the 1930s humongous infrastructure project, under Roosevelt, the investment in the Tennessee Valley Authority that was meant to bring electricity, plumbing to a lot of areas in the southern region, frankly, that did not have that.
Yeah.
And also to alleviate some of the more, I guess you could say, random flooding with purposeful flooding.
Yeah.
So they purposely flooded areas, created dams to control the power, to have more, the power of the waterways, to have more, control over where the water went. And there's a whole, if you've seen Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? That's the name of the film.
Art Thou?
The Coen Brothers film.
Yep.
It's about the process of establishing the Tennessee Valley Authority and, taking land by eminent domain and literally flooding people out of their property. So they were, there was a process of deciding what areas would be sacrificed so that more areas could, live without flooding.
Right.
So anyway, even in today's experience with climate change, I think a lot of us are living through moments, hurricanes and these humongous natural disasters where we don't really know if you might be able to, travel down the byways and the highways, if they literally won't be there. So I think it's an interesting full circle moment where we think, oh, we're sophisticated. We have all of the, the modern comforts, but it's not a given that you'll be able to get where you need to go necessarily.
Yeah.
Even here, for those who live along the Dorchester Bay, there's a lot of areas that flood.
Yeah,
a lot of flooding here. So
and it's interesting. There's so much there to unpack. But first, I have to say, Louisiana Bayou Coast. That's straight up hurricane alley, tornado too. And so really, being mindful of what you do and don't have control over is a part of just the live experience in certain parts of the world, and particularly in Southern culture. But, what I appreciate about some of the things that you were saying as it relates to this saying, that's interesting. It's like, okay, the God willing piece. Like, of course, we have no clue what's going to happen, but the creek don't rise piece. What I find fascinating there is a juxtaposition to the first part of the phrase, right? Because based on the oral history or the history that you gave, that there was control there, right? Someone made conscious decisions around what part of the landmass to flood.
That's true.
And others that they didn't touch, right? And so what I think about when I hear how people embody the phrase, it's really this give and take around how do you acknowledge that there are certain aspects of life that is beyond anyone's control. It's the faith piece of it. Even if you're not a religious person, everyone has to reconcile that we don't have too much control over much. Like it's just a fact of life.
That's true.
And then this other piece that as much as that's the case, there are still aspects of life that is very much so control and that impacts certain people from a geographic perspective or a demographic perspective in a very different way because it is controlled. Yes. And it is a choice. Right. And so it's just interesting having to live with that both and piece. And that's what that phrase kind of it brings up for me. Yeah.
I think of around this moment of the use of the phrase control. It is an interesting juxtaposition between the emphasis that was placed on plans and being careful about thinking of your future and, getting your ducks in a row, if you will, and making sure, that your I's were dotted, your T's were crossed, all of those things. And the ultimate fact that really, even if you do all of those things, something that you want still might not come to pass. And if it doesn't, that's God's will.
Yeah.
So I think there's a lot of conditions in what I just shared, but there's a lot of conditions in terms of at least the way that I was brought up to think about how you prepare, how you come correct, and I wasn't thinking of that necessarily as leadership lessons, from the cradle per se.
Yeah.
But you plan, you do your part, and then God willing and the creek don't rise, it all comes to pass.
Yeah.
And so it's this I think out in some ways.
Yeah.
And it's almost like this way of saying, yes, I've done my part.
Yes.
I've done all of the things.
Yeah.
I've put the ducks in a row. I've set out my dress for the event, or, what have you. I have my homework done and I've packed my bags. But who knows if tomorrow's plans will actually unfold in the way that I intend for them to go. And I do think as a leader, the unknown, in terms of, especially as you come into management roles, how you become comfortable with letting go of the fact that some other people will need to execute on things that have your name ultimately, on it. It's a little similar, it's not exactly, but it's this sense of, yes, you will need to delegate and other people do things under your watch, but it's not necessary for you to, micromanage the process. And ultimately, is their product anyway.
Yeah.
Is their product anyway. So I think, there's something about this give and take between being prepared for all of the things that are within your control and then knowing ultimately it's not all in your control.
Yeah.
And leadership is like that.
Yeah, it is. And, you're making me go back to my seminary days and like how, a huge part of me excuse me, it's reconciling like these theological concepts. And, we're friends, so you know how much I wrestle with words and phrases and things, and trying to make them make sense, like make it make sense, right?
Right.
And so when I think about this phrase, like I think about it from this cultural perspective more than I do from a theological lens, right? Because I think it goes back to something that you said in our first episode when we recorded with each other around sometimes you have situations and they're just bad situations and you don't want to like relive them. And for me, I struggle with this sense that every single thing that happens is God's quote unquote will.
Okay.
I haven't rested on that, although I value and appreciate the phrase. I value and appreciate what it means. I just struggle with whether or not how that gets actualized when really not so great things happen, right? Because I think that sometimes bad things happen. It kind of is what it is. And that is life. It's like, we have day, we have night, we have up, we have down. Like it's, and having to justify it, I don't think you necessarily does, because that's the way in which God created life and humanity and the earth and the universe. Like, there's always these things interacting against each other, right? It's just, sometimes it's a violent place. Like,
yes, I think one of the things, from a historical context that I could think about and, that really we should probably talk about or could talk about is, imagine you do have a set of plans in place and then a rainstorm comes.
Yeah.
I mean, just the literalness of this thing is just, okay, I planned to go visit so-and-so. I can't because I cannot get there. I can't cross that. The bridge is flooded. The road washed out.
A pandemic came.
And so you hear where I'm headed.
Yeah.
There is something I cannot do.
You can't control. Yeah.
And I think that's where, this whole piece of it's like more of a nod to the fact that natural disasters happen.
It happens.
The unexpected, the out of our control happens. And so maybe that is, to your point, it's not necessarily, even though God is in the phrase, not necessarily like, that there is a
that God wanted
scripture
this to
and
happen
verse,
to you.
right? That there's a
Yeah,
chapter
yeah,
and verse related to this
yeah.
thing. It's more of an acknowledgement of the fact that
Things happen.
Things happen.
Yeah, and I think what happens sometimes is that when bad things happen, sometimes it may be viewed as a punishment, right?
Yeah, that
or
fire
like
and brimstone
yes,
kind of.
that's underneath it.
Yeah.
Instead of looking at it from the perspective of, you know, life is complex, things happen, and learning how to adjust and adapt to it. And I think for me, for the saint in my life, from a theological perspective, really being able to lean into that a little bit more,
Right.
instead of feeling like punishment, you know.
Yeah.
But yeah, in a leadership capacity, in a leadership role, you know, this whole piece of God willing and the creek don't
Don't rise.
don't rise. You know, I think that as a leader, if you're not nimble and you don't have the ability to be flexible, I mean, can you even call yourself a leader?
That part.
Like, I mean, you can't,
Yeah.
right? Because things are going to happen.
Yes.
And you have to have the mental ability to be able to be flexible, to be able to think critically, and the ability to make decisions based on the environment that you just can't control.
Exactly.
Right?
Did you have a Weeble Wobble growing up? You know what a Weeble Wobble is?
Are those like the little like devices that you put your 2 feet on and you kind of like move back and forth?
No, it was like a big plastic dummy that had a weight in it, and you could punch it. We could weeble, we could wobble, but we won't fall down. Basically, it was like a punching.
So this is one of those Southern different experiences, y'all. I didn't have it.
For all of y'all who know what a weeble wobble is, I often think of that sometimes, like, okay, you know, what's gonna come next, and how do I, you know, not brace myself, literally, how do we evade?
Yeah.
And then even if something does temporarily knock things off course, how do we just come back? You know, it's not even
Yeah.
about a plan A and B. It's like plans A through E.
Yeah, you know what? I like the imagery of that better, because in my head I think about you know, the whack-a-mole.
No.
Well, you know, you're like always you're it's
Oh, whack-a-mole.
whack-a-mole. I said whack-a-mole. Whack-a-mole.
Oh, my goodness.
When you're always just trying to hit the thing back down, and it's just
Yes.
exhausting, and that feels way more reactionary
Right.
to me. And what you're describing is more the ability to be in shape, because your core got to be right to be able to move to move back and forth. But it gives you you're centered in a different way than having to chase something down, right? And I think, you know, when I think about leadership and the ability to tackle very difficult situations, the way in which you approach it matters. And that imagery really brought that up for me.
It's one is empowering and the other one is this breathless chase.
Yeah.
Ultimately, you know you're never going to win.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting because depending on the circumstance and the situation, does one have the ability to choose, you know, because like certain environments just lend to just like you're constantly just trying to put a fire out, right? And there's other situations where you have the ability to be a little more nuanced. And I'm wondering, is that more environmentally shaped, or is that more individual as it relates to the ability to be able to navigate any situation?
I don't know. I don't think it's possible to prepare yourself. I mean, I'm not a logistics specialist, so y'all, you know, out there listening, correct me. I'm not sure. I feel personally overwhelmed by the expectation to be able to appropriately navigate any situation. I think that's like too tall of an order. It's not a realistic expectation.
Yeah.
But to be able to say, listen, there are some things in the realm of possibility here. You know, this is my range.
Yeah.
And anything in this particular range, I think I can handle.
Yeah.
And maybe there's some things on the growing edge that I can also do. But I'm not going to be able to handle everything. And I think that's okay.
Yeah, I agree. And I think about, you know, when I became the vice chair of the Cambridge School Committee here, and I was so happy. I was pregnant, and I was like, I could do this. I can pop this baby out. I can lead here and do all these things. And then COVID hit, and I had no clue. What I was getting myself into.
None of us did.
Yeah, well, yeah.
But particularly in a leadership capacity like what you had stepped into.
Yeah, and I think that for the first time, it was kind of like people saw behind the curtain as it relates to what it takes to move things forward in an educational context in a way that probably people weren't paying attention to before, because this decision around whether or not you send your kids to school or the ability to do it, people were so invested in it in a different way that they were like, oh, well, okay, how does that decision get made? Oh, so this has to be a contract negotiation, and this has to be between the school committee and a union. And it wasn't just this yes, you make the decision type of situation. And it was a God willing moment, because I made it through. I negotiated 4 contracts in a year time,
Wow.
with a newborn, Was I prepared for that? Absolutely not. But I have this saying that when you're in leadership, you don't get to choose the moment chooses you. And I think that connects back to this phrase, this God willing. It's we have no clue what's going to happen on our life's journey. But do we have the ability to be able to be nimble? Do we have the ability to be flexible? And do we have the internal skill set to either rise to the moment or crumble and fall to it?
Yeah. And I think the choices that we're empowered with now, I recognize that we do live in an age of more agency than our foremothers had.
Yes.
There's still a long way to go, but I do relish how far we've come, and I appreciate how far we've come, even though we're not resting on our laurels and aren't satisfied with some of the disparities that exist. And I do think about the infrastructure disparities that a phrase like that acknowledges.
Yeah.
Saying, well, it might not be possible for me to follow through with my intentions for my life or my plans for the day based on disparities in environmental justice.
Yeah.
And that's really what that's about, those circumstances. I think that's what they're about. I mean, yes, they could just generally be about a hurricane, and that's random. But the kind of making it super local, what parts of the South we lived in, how well resourced those parts were or are, how close they are to low-lying flood-prone areas, how quickly the roads in our neighborhoods got paved. I mean, just all of those things. We do live with these legacies of lack.
Yes.
Even though, I operate from an abundance mindset, but it's still true that we live with the remnants of, delays in justice and equitable delivery of public resources that would make a phrase like that seem less tangible to folks outside of something like a natural disaster. But, I really do think that most of those kinds of experiences, in many cases, for folks living in the South, it's not exactly about natural disasters. It's like purposeful disasters. That's planned. It's not like happenstance so much.
Yeah.
So, we've come a long way, I think, and yet, we're living with the legacy of generations of disparity. So, God willing and the creek don't rise. We are going to kind of push even more towards equality in lots of different ways.
Yeah, and what I want to hold with this phrase, you're right. We've come such a long way, and I think that regardless if you come from a class or group of people that are traditionally disenfranchised, I think that people can resonate with not being able to bring something to fruition that is a deep passion or desire,
Yeah.
right? And so even if you take that piece away, like the disenfranchisement, the environmental piece, I think that's a human thing, that if you're trying to achieve something and you're just struggling and you can't do it, I think people can relate to that across multiple different demographics and things of that nature. However, when you add back in that element, right, of the environmental factors, and it gives more context to the phrase God willing. And I just want to hold up just all the people that are a part of my community that I grew up in, and multiple generations that laid the groundwork for us to be here. They were smart. They were dynamic. They were gifted. They were resilient. But the environment did not lead to them being able to manifest their full purpose, even if they tried, right? Even if they kept using the phrase God willing, I'm going to keep at it, God willing, and the creek don't rise. And they just showed up, they did the work, they were present, they added their contribution to society, their family, but it still didn't manifest, right? That's that environmental piece. And I just want to hold those people up, and even individuals that's listening today, right? If there's something that's a deep passion or something that you've hold dear to you that hasn't been able to manifest itself for whatever reason, God willing, it'll come together for you one day.
Keep trying.
Just keep at it.
Keep trying.
Yeah.
I like that. I think that's a good place for us to land today.
Yeah.
Thank you all for listening.
Yeah. And of course, continue to get this chili grits in your life.
And keep sending us your ideas of other phrases that we should cover. Keep sending your feedback. We thank you so much for listening.
Yes. And until next time, we'll see you on our next recording of Chili Grits Podcast.
Yep.